So I want to start with this observation by Walter Lippmann because I think it is really remains foundational to the way that we look at the world. What each man does is based not on direct and certain knowledge, but on pictures made by himself or given to him. The way in which the world is imagined determines at any particular moment what men will do. Not the way the world is, but the way that it is thought to be. To that pseudo-environment, his behavior is a response. But because it is behavior, the consequences operate not in the pseudo-environment where the behavior is stimulated, but in the real environment where action eventuates. So this is the process that we're interested in. What are the pictures in people's heads and how are they driving their assessment of issues? How are they driving their voting habits? How are they driving their understanding of race and other issues? Thinking about that this way means that you need to toss out the dominant way of thinking about communications, that people are not empty vessels waiting for your report or your fact sheet or whatever to happen, and that most of your time is spent creating a lovely news release that is supposed to attract their attention, etc. But rather, what you need to pay attention to is the swamp that is in people's minds, the vast array of pre-existing ideas about an issue that we carry with us and use to map on to the incoming information. So here are the swamp characteristics, and I'm going to go through each of these as they relate to structures. When information is unfocused and ill-formed, incoming facts just sink. You can put reams of information in front of people, but when it is disconnected, it just disappears. Some parts of the swamp are thick and teeming, and they reproduce themselves. So here are the things that are waiting to eat your incoming information. Other parts of the swamp are so aggressive that they eat the incoming information. And in some parts of the swamp, there are potentially useful and ecologically sound environments that require cultivation over time. And this is the hopeful aspect of reframing. So I want to look at each of these and how they are structured and what happens when we do a good job or do a bad job of connecting with these parts of the swamp. So first, what are the structures of expectation and how do they work for sociopolitical issues? Well, first, most people are not walking around thinking about most issues most of the time. And when they do on sociopolitical issues, they are drawing upon a reservoir that comes from news media, still largely local television entertainment. Now that may change. There's a lot of argument in the political science literature about whether it will or not, or whether the same narratives are now being recreated in shorter forms in the new media. But nevertheless, what we know is that there is a mirroring effect between the news that people have available to them and the way that they look at issues. Unfortunately, what people have available to them is not terribly robust on the kinds of issues that we care about. So most of the news is devoted to crime and accidents, accounting for 50% of news. Now, one reason that is the case is because it's cheap news to make, and we are talking about a structured industry where the structure has a certain purpose, which is to deliver eyeballs to advertisers. And this is a cheap way to cover news. Human interest, culture, entertainment, another large slice. And then this little red widget up here of 25% is where all the other news related to the issues that we care about happens. So in here is domestic issues, science, foreign relations, military, business, etc. So the exposure to actual information is relatively small, and people are paying relatively little attention to it to begin with. So that leads us to a question about why people don't take responsibility for social issues, which is often the discussion at the roundtables that I go to with advocates. I mean, why is it that people can't understand that global warming is the most pressing issue on the planet? Well, you can say they live in red or blue states, or they're venal, self-interested people, but you could also step back and say they don't have a clue. They don't have the slightest idea how to create a relationship between themselves and the incoming information. It is uncoagulated, and they are literally in an idea soup. So when you think of an issue that you're not relatively familiar with, which is a good way to put on your ordinary person hat, there are all these things swirling around that are not organized. So in global warming? Is it something to do with car exhaust? Is it something to do with an ozone hole? Is it getting hotter or is it getting colder? Is it about temperature or is it about cleanliness? Is it happening right now or is it on a long trajectory? So these kinds of things are just swirling around people, and what we know from the work that we do is that they will disappear, and people will be left without any clue how to relate to this incoming information. So people may be very concerned about global warming, but if they have no idea how it works, these things just slide off of them. So when incoming information is unfocused and ill-formed, incoming facts just sink in the swamp of structures of mind. Our second way of looking at the swamp is that some parts of the swamp are thick and teeming and they reproduce themselves. And I think it's here really that there are real insights looking across the issues we work on for issues of race. So first, people are good learners, good social learners, and they are veterans of perception. So when they have learned a lesson about how the world works, they have it stored. And when the incoming information isn't making sense, they pull up a way of looking at the world. They have a stance, one might call it, relative to the world. So as Deborah Tannen says, this prior experience takes the form of expectations about the world. And in the vast majority of cases, the world, being a systematic place, confirms these expectations, saving the individual the trouble of figuring things out anew all the time. So here is where patterns of learned behavior in the pseudo-environment become so powerful that when you put in front of people even contesting information, they cannot see the contesting information. They will only see the information that conforms to the structures of expectation. In focus groups we did on youth, we put in front of people a news story about how young people's risk-taking behavior had been reduced, that their college drinking was down, binge drinking was down, dangerous driving, other kinds of things. People first refused to read those facts. They just simply didn't talk about them. And when we pointed them back to them and said, did you take a look at this? They said, yeah, but kids have all these opportunities these days, they should be better. So they had a way to map on their expectation that teenagers were out of control and reckless, and to make whatever was in front of them conform to that expectation. So that's really where these things begin to get embedded, so that people can only see a couple of ways of looking at the world. What we would say, looking at the work that we do, is that there are narrative structures that get embedded in the way that we think about the world, and that these systematically advantage individualistic explanations of social problems and make systemic explanations literally hard to think, as Claude Lévi-Strauss said. So there are a couple of different ways to look at this. The work of Chantal Iyengar at Stanford over the last 2 decades has been stunning and consistent in showing that the episodic form of news coverage, little episodes that happen that are disconnected over time, leads people to attribute problems to individuals. Whereas pulling back and getting a landscape, getting a more thematic causal story allows you to see that individuals live inside communities, live inside systems, and are influenced and shaped by these systems. The problem with this distinction is that on any given issue that we look at when we do media content analyses, you can see as much as 90% of the news be episodic. So if you think about the drip drip on one's head, it is saying to us over and over again, individuals are responsible, individuals are responsible. The sort of bootstrap paradigm is being telegraphed by the narrative structure of the dominant way of thinking about news. So this is just a contrast between these two kind of habits of narrative. The episodic stories focus on individuals, thematic stories look at issues, episodic stories look at individual events, thematic stories look at trends. The episodic stories go deep into the psychology of the person, and most of the explanations for why the person acts the way they do are what we would call mentalist or psychological, whereas thematic stories are more sociological. Episodic stories appeal to consumers. There are things you can buy to fix this, or things you can do, or things you can know and make to fix this problem. Whereas thematic stories appeal to citizens and try to get them to understand that better policies would fix the conditions and allow people to make choices. whereas the other one, the episodic, is all about fixing the person. The problem with the narratives that advocates adopt is that they often mimic this narrative structure. They are being told to tell stories about individuals, tell stories that help us understand what it would feel like not to have healthcare insurance, without understanding that the master narrative that they are communicating is that individuals are responsible. So what we try to do is to help people see how to tell more thematic stories, and to look at the news media as another structure that is telegraphing a particular way of thinking about these issues. So here is the coverage that we did on youth. The most common activity for teens is socializing. When at school, they are socializing, not doing work. They are hanging out, and in 6 broadcast networks, 6 weeks, 92 episodes of entertainment television, there was no example of a youth involved in a societal issue. So if we wonder why people's expectations of youth are to be solipsistic, to be self-interested and reckless and not engaged with the issues that adults care about, the drip that is happening in entertainment television is structuring a kind of expectation about who youth are and what they do. The news coverage here, youth aren't very visible on news coverage, but when they are victims or perpetrators. And only 7% of the coverage is thematic. So if you think about what this is structuring, it's sort of random acts of violence or victimhood perpetrated by young people and not contextualized with any situation. We don't know what's happened to those kids. We don't. So if you think of the structure of this story and then you try to tell a new story about youth, you are up against something that's already embedded in our brain. You're up against a rut that has been formed over time. So let's look at race. This is the content analysis that we just produced, and it's up on our website. Racism was framed as an interpersonal dynamic. It is enacted through blatant or overt discriminatory actions. Institutional or structural racism is the aggregate of those actions. So it's not happening in institutions. It's not a dynamic. It's just an aggregate of individual issues. The news articles were dominated by anecdotes like an employer parading around as a Klansman, and those were seen as aberrant and unfortunate acts perpetrated by people who were out of touch with the mainstream of the society which had moved on. So you're hearing episodic. So if we think about why people can't see racism built-in structures, what they are being telegraphed repeatedly is it's about individuals who are acting out outside of the norm. Then it's all about the internal psychology of people. Individual beliefs, attitudes, and mentalities are the most commonly cited explanation of why racial disparities exist. Core habits of mind of Black people that impeded their occupational success were the unconscious bias of doctors who treat people of color. So these are sort of psychological problems then, consistent with the episodic way of looking at the world, that need to be treated one by one by one. And of course, the answer to most of these issues is to increase diversity and racial sensitivity courses for these people, not to open opportunities to minorities in these fields. So the problem definition is individual, the answer is individual, and it's a highly satisfactory way to think because it's happening across every issue that you're exposed to. So this is an important point. There was no discussion in the news coverage of why anyone should care if they were not the subject of these acts. So why this mattered to all Americans, other than what our researcher called adding more diversity would add more flavor to the experience of whites. So there really is no notion of what we've called the notion of shared fate. There is no notion that this is a problem in the structure of the society that needs to be corrected for all of us.